What's up, guys? It's your bro Richie here again. So your bro Richie here again. Today is now part 2 on hot rods. So without any further ado, let's continue on. So part two on hot rods. So without any further ado, let's continue on. So the next part of mine is history. Starting off with the first one is the 1920s to 1945. This should be interesting. So let's do it. It's kind of when hot rods were first evolved back then. Early early speedsters, so 1920s to 1945. So early early speedsters dating back to the 1910s and 1910s and 1920s. So 1910s and 1920s are considered to be one of the ancestors of the hot rod movement. These were race cars. These were race cars often based on Ford Model Ts. So these were race cars often based on Ford Model. These were race cars often based on Ford Model Ts. So often based on Ford Model Ts. So Ford Model Ts. So Model Ts. And modified with custom bodies. Modified with custom bodies. Another forerunner to the hot rod were another forerunner to the hot rod were the modified cars um, used in the Prohibition era by bootleggers to evade revenue agents and other uh, law enforcement. That was when they were running moonshine, because there were moonshine runners back in the day, because they often like escaped the cops, like doing 180 degree turns, just speeding off to the opposite direction. And back then, they didn't always. Not only did they ever stick to the roads, but they took shortcuts across like dirt paths and all that kind of stuff through the woods, crossing creeks, fallen trees, steep terrain, all that kind of stuff. Tight inclines, probably, I don't know, but back then, like, they were just like cutting corners to evade the cops. That's how they did it back then. Um, so these were race cars. So wait, hold on. These are race cars often based on Ford Model Ts. So these are race cars. These are race cars often based on Ford. These are race cars often built. These are race cars often built. So these are race cars often based on Ford Model Ts, and modified with custom bodies. Another forerunner to the hot rod were the another forerunner to the hot rod were the modified. Another forerunner to the hot rod. Another forerunner to the hot rod were the. So another forerunner to the hot rod. So another forerunner to the hot rod were the modified cars used in the Prohibition era by bootleggers to evade revenue agents and other law enforcement. Hot rods first appeared in the late 1930s in Southern California, where people raced modified cars on dry lake beds northeast of LA, so northeast of Los Angeles, under the rules of the SCTA, Southern California Timing Association, among other groups. This gained popularity. This gained popularity after World War II, so after the Second World War, particularly in California, because many returning soldiers, many returning soldiers had received technical training. The first hot rods were old cars, most often Fords, most often Fords, typically 1910s, 1920s Model Ts, 1928, 1930, 1928, 1931 Model A's, or the Model B's from 1932 to 1934. So 1932, 1934 Model B's, modified to reduce weight, so modified to be much lighter than before. The motor swaps often involved fitting the Ford Flathead V8 motor, known as the Flatty. So Ford Flathead V8 into a different car. For example, the common practice in the 1940s of installing the 60 horsepower version into a Jeep chassis, which was pretty powerful in the 1940s, but now it's not so much. So installing a 60 horsepower version into a Jeep chassis. Typical mods were removal of convertible rooftops, hoods, bumpers, windshields, the front and rear bumpers, windshields, and or fenders, channeling the body and modifying the motor by tuning and or replacing with a more powerful one. So they make it more lighter and much more powerful and faster. So with a more powerful type. Wheels and tires were changed for improved traction and handling. Hot rod, so both improved grip and handling. Hot rods built before 1945, the year the Second World War ended. So hot rods built before 1945 commonly used 35 Ford, so 1935 Ford wire spoke wheels. You don't often see those type of wheels anymore. Usually forgotten, or they are still around, but it's very rare to even see those wheels anymore. Anyways, next up, 1945. 1945 to 1960. So after World War II, many small military airports throughout the country were either abandoned or rarely used. So either abandoned or rarely even used anyway, allowing hot rodders across the country to race on marked courses. Originally, drag racing had originally drag racing had tracks as long as just 1 mile or more, and included up to 4 lanes of racing simultaneously. simultaneously, as some hot rodders also raced on the street and need a race for an organization to promote safety and to provide venues for safe racing. The NHRA the NHRA was founded in 1951 during the very early 50s. So during the start of the very early 1950s, to take drag racing off the streets and to both take drag racing off the streets and into controlled environments. In both the 50s and 60s, the Ford Flathead V8 motor was supplanted by the Chrysler Firepower motor, known as the early Hemi. Many hot rods would upgrade the brakes from mechanical to hydraulic juice, as they kind of call it. So from mechanical to hydraulic, and headlights from the original light bulbs to sealed beams. A typical mid 50s to early 60s custom Deuce was fenderless and steeply chopped, powered by either a Ford or Mercury flathead V8. Either a Ford or Mercury flathead V8 with an Edelbrock intake manifold, So Edelbrock intake manifold. Um, Harman and Collins Magneto. Not sure what that is. Magneto. The heck is that? An electrical generator that uses permanent magnets to produce periodic pulses of alternating current. Unlike a dynamo, Magneto doesn't. Unlike a dynamo, a Magneto doesn't contain a a a commutator to produce direct current. It's categorized as a form of alternator, although it's usually considered direct, not direct, although it's usually considered distinct from most other although it's usually considered distinct from most other alternators, which uses field coils rather than just permanent magnets. Interesting. So a typical mid 50s to early 60s, so 55 to 60 custom use was fenderless, and steeply chopped, powered by the four-door Mercury flathead V8 with an Edelbrock intake manifold, Harman and Collins Magneto. Not sure what that is. Well, I'm just telling you what it is. So it's like some kind of alternator thing. And Halley brand quick change differential. Front suspension hairpins were adapted from sprint cars. So sprint cars, such as the Curtis Crafts. As hot rodding became more popular, both magazines and associations catering to hot rodders were started, such as the magazine Hot Rod, founded in magazine Hot Rod, founded in 1948. Last but certainly not the very least, before I just wrap it up for now, we got 1960 and onwards. Cars often, sorry, hold on. Cars offered by the major automakers began increasing performance. The lure of hot rods the lure of hot rods began of hot the lure of hot rods began to wane with the advent of the muscle car. With the advent of the muscle car, uh, it's now possible to it's now possible to purchase a high performance car straight from the showroom. It's very rare that happens anyway. However, the 1973 oil crisis caused car manu- caused car However, the 1973 oil crisis caused the 1973 the 1973 oil crisis. However, the 1973 oil crisis. So the 1973 oil crisis caused car manufacturers to focus on fuel to focus more on fuel efficiency over performance, which led to a resurgence of interest in hot rodding as the focus shifted away from racing. The modified cars became known as street rods. The NSRA, National Street Rod Association, was both formed and began hosting events. By the 1970s, the 5.7 liter um 5.7 liter small block the 5.7 liter small block Chevy 350 V8. So Chevy 350 V8 was the most common choice of motors for hot rods. Another popular motor choice is the Ford Windsor V8. During the 1980s, during the 80s, during the 80s, many car manufacturers were reducing the displacements of their motors. In other words, making them smaller. Thus making it tougher for hot rod builders to obtain larger displacement motors, so to obtain bigger engines. Instead, motor build is to have like bigger motors. Instead, motor builders had to modify the smaller motors. So the smaller motors, such as using both non-standard crankshafts and pistons to obtain larger displacement. While current production V8s uh tended to be the most tended to be the most frequent candidates. So tended to be the most frequent candidates. This also applies to others. In the mid 80s, so in the mid 1980s, so 1985 somewhere there, as standard motor sizes diminished, Rodders discovered the 3.5 liter 215 aluminum block, either Buick or Oldsmobile V8. Could be so either Buick or Oldsmobile V8. So Buick or Oldsmobile V8 could be modified for substantially greater displacement with many wrecking yard parts. There's usually parts from like junkyards and other places as well. So it could be modified for substantially greater displacement with mainly wrecking yard parts, so parts from like junkyards and all that. This trend was not limited to American cars. VW, for example, so Volkswagen enthusiasts simply stretched stretched stock 1.6 liter 98 inline fours to over 120 cubic inches. That's to over 2 liters. So it's over 2 liters. It's over 2 liters. All right. So that's it for now. So for my next video will be about light. So for my next video will be about lifestyle. So for my next video will be about lifestyle. So that'll be it. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.